Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and decode the dense planning terminology of ISO 14001-2026, specifically Clause 3.2. Now, if you're involved in environmental management systems, or EMS, you already know the standards can sometimes read like a complete maze of jargon. But this terminology? It's definitely not just linguistic fluff. It's the literal structural engineering of your entire environmental strategy. So today, we're going to focus strictly on the planning terminology because honestly, getting this wrong is exactly where most systems begin to unravel.
So, what is the fastest way to fail an ISO 14001 audit? Now, you might be thinking it's a massive, highly visible chemical spill, or maybe a blatant regulatory violation. But actually, no. It is a fundamental misunderstanding of the planning terminology. Lead auditors consistently find that when an organization misinterprets the foundational definitions, well, their entire system is essentially built on sand.
To prevent those systemic audit failures, we're going to walk through this exact roadmap. We'll hit the terminology trap, aspects versus impacts, defining compliance obligations, managing environmental risks, and finally, aligning for audit success.
Let's start right off with Section 1, the terminology trap, and why definitions dictate your audit survival. Here's the thing. Terminology in Clause 3.2 isn't just a glossary at the back of a book. It is the literal foundation of your EMS. How you define your terms dictates exactly what you monitor, what you control, and ultimately what an auditor evaluates. When terms are ambiguous or maybe just inconsistently understood across your team, your environmental plans might look perfectly compliant on paper, but they are going to structurally fail an audit. I mean, if your team thinks environment only means the physical trees and water immediately outside your facility, you might completely overlook the environmental interactions of your supply chain. That imprecision is a trap, and it creates hidden nonconformances long before an auditor even walks through the door. And this idea is beautifully captured in the source material. A poorly defined scope can literally lead to incomplete audits and the total exclusion of environmentally significant activities. Misinterpreting this foundation means your entire system is misaligned right out of the gate. You end up concealing significant environmental aspects, totally blinding your organization to real, actionable compliance risks.
Moving on to Section 2, aspects versus impacts, or as I like to think of it, action and consequence. Let's see how this builds into the cause and effect relationship of your day-to-day operations. You absolutely must understand this precise ISO wording. An environmental aspect is the point of interaction. It's simply what you do. Think of a chemical plant's solvent usage, a food processor's water consumption, or even a logistics company's fuel consumption. The aspect is the specific action you take that touches the environment, whether that's during normal operations, abnormal situations, or even in an emergency.
And that brings us to the consequence, the environmental impact. If the aspect is the action, the impact is the actual change to the environment. It's the result. This could be air pollution from those evaporating solvents, the depletion of local water resources, or greenhouse gas emissions. But notice something super important in this definition. It says whether adverse or beneficial. Impacts are not always negative. Planting a protected wetland as part of a site restoration project, that is absolutely a beneficial environmental impact.
The dynamic to burn into your memory here is cause and effect. If you mix these two up, your EMS will break down, for sure. For example, if you incorrectly define chemical storage as an impact instead of an aspect, you're going to fail to identify the true risks associated with the leak, like soil contamination. By understanding that chemical storage is the aspect, the cause, you can implement the right preventive operational controls way before the effect, the impact, ever happens.
Now, obviously, not every aspect requires massive corporate resources to manage, and this brings us to the concept of a significant environmental aspect. This is determined by evaluating things like severity, likelihood, legal exposure, and stakeholder concerns. Take a thermal power plant, for example. They're going to flag sulfur dioxide emissions as a highly significant aspect because of the severe impact on air quality and public health. This prioritization step is absolutely crucial. It ensures you're focusing your resources where the potential for environmental harm is the absolute highest.
All right, let's jump to Section 3, defining compliance obligations. These are essentially the rules of the game. So now that we have our aspects and impacts sorted out, what are the boundaries we actually have to adhere to? What you should really take away from this definition is the phrase, or chooses to comply with. The 2026 standard expands compliance far beyond just statutory environmental laws. Honestly, if you're only looking at government regulations, you are missing half the picture.
Compliance obligations are split into two very clear categories:
You have your mandatory legal requirements, your permits, your emission limits, your waste laws, standard stuff. But you also have voluntary stakeholder commitments. And here is exactly where organizations often trip up in an audit. ISO 14001:2026 treats a publicly declared voluntary commitment, like a big corporate pledge to reach carbon neutrality or signing on to an industry code of practice, as just as binding as a government permit. Let me repeat that. Once you adopt it, you must manage it.
So the stakes become very clear here. A narrow interpretation that ignores stakeholder expectations is going to leave your legal register incomplete. If a lead auditor sees that your CEO made a massive public pledge to reduce water usage, but it's nowhere to be found in your compliance obligations register, yeah, that is going to trigger a major nonconformance.
Which brings us to Section 4, Managing Environmental Risks, or Navigating Uncertainty. Once we know our significant aspects and our compliance obligations, we have to deal with the unknown. Within this ISO framework, risk is simply defined as the effect of uncertainty. Integrating this concept shifts your entire EMS from a system of reactive correction, waiting for a pipe to burst and then fixing it, to a system of proactive prevention. It forces you to look at your environmental objectives and ask, okay, what uncertainties could completely derail this?
A lead auditor is going to expect you to anticipate a wide variety of these deviations. Sure, this includes pollution incidents and regulatory non-compliance, but it also extends to climate-related operational disruptions, sudden resource scarcity, and even reputational damage from an environmental failure. You really have to demonstrate that you've thought about how both external and internal uncertainties could negatively impact your environmental performance.
But wait, there is a flip side to this coin. Risk isn't just about avoiding disaster, it is also about identifying the opportunity to innovate. ISO 14001 demands that you look for beneficial uncertainties too, opportunities to adopt renewable energy, improve resource efficiency, or implement circular economy practices that drastically reduce waste. Managing risk means capturing these awesome opportunities just as much as mitigating the threats.
Okay, let's wrap this up with Section 5, Aligning for Audit Success. Let's bring it all together. Let's look at how these 4 distinct terms actually lock together to guarantee a robust, audit-proof system. This is the ultimate domino effect of environmental planning. First, an action happens in your facility. That is your aspect. Second, it changes the environment in some way. That is your impact. Third, that interaction triggers a set of mandatory or voluntary rules you have to follow, your compliance obligations. And fourth, this entire process creates uncertainty that must be managed proactively, your risk. These aren't just isolated lists. They are a continuous flow of logic.
These are highly interrelated concepts. Think about it like this. If you can sit down with a lead auditor and demonstrate exactly how a significant aspect on your shop floor flows directly into a specific compliance obligation, and then show exactly how you are managing the risk of failing that obligation, your EMS is going to be absolutely bulletproof. It proves your system isn't just a dusty binder on a shelf. It's a living, breathing control mechanism. So I want to leave you with this one thought. Are your organization's planning documents truly speaking the exact language of ISO 14001:2026? Seriously, review your registers today. Look at your aspects, your impacts, your obligations, and your risks. Because getting this terminology exactly right isn't just some boring paperwork exercise, it is the literal difference between a passing audit and a systemic failure. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I will catch you next time.